I'm supposed to talk to you guys about alphabets, but I will tell you my background is that I'm a mathematician. Everybody's forgotten that because all I talk about now is Karl Marx. And so I'll tell you a joke I read, a math joke. Everybody loves a math joke. It's not. It's a mathematician joke. I read this the other day. I loved it. You'll love it. I promise you'll love it. So get ready to laugh. Get ready to laugh real hard. So, there's a medical emergency. The person's like, oh my God, help, we need a doctor. And I say, well, I'm a doctor. And they say, well my friend's dying. I'm like, well, I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm like, what kind of doctor are you? I'm a mathematician. I'm a doctor of mathematics. Yeah, but my friend's dying. Well, okay, that's -1. Told you you're going to laugh. Yeah, there we go. Oh. So, okay, now that you're warmed up properly for doomsday, I'm supposed to talk to you about alphabet soup, about these acronyms. And I'm actually going to talk about 4. I'm not actually going to talk very much about CRT. Turns out that there are 2 CRTs. There's critical race theory. Well, there's 3, really, because there's also culturally relevant teaching. That's the other CRT. And then there's culturally responsive teaching, and that's the other CRT. That's how they get you. There's no CRT in schools. We're doing culturally relevant teaching. It's completely different. It's not critical race theory. It's a different CRT. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, there's lots of other acronyms. In fact, my friend Vivek Ramaswamy, who wrote Woke Inc., I don't know if you know who he is, he says that we have a tyranny of acronyms right now. So we're going to go through 4 acronyms today. And they are, if I can do them and if I can remember the right order, DEI, so that's diversity, equity, inclusion. You might want to write all these letters down. They're all 3-letter acronyms, so there'll be 12 letters in all. DEI, and then we're going to go into SDG, that's Sustainable Development Goals. And then there is ESG, that's Environmental, Social, and Governance. And we will come back to these if you can't get them all down the first time. And then there is SEL, and that's Social Emotional Learning. So these 4 acronyms, actually I wouldn't even really talk that much about DEI, but it's a good touch point and I got asked to. So these 4 acronyms are the 3 that we're going to talk about after the first one, are really kind of the defining thing of what's happening in the world today. If you had to just narrow it down and say, there's too much, what do I focus on? Well, there's just these 3 little acronyms, that's it. They're just small things, they're just acronyms. SDG, ESG, SEL. We're not going to have to worry about, we'll let other people later talk about CSE, that's Comprehensive Sexuality Education, among other things. They all have lots of meanings. So we're just going to talk about these. So what is DEI? Well, let me play with the audience participation part at the beginning. Let me start with audience participation. I'm going to give you a definition out of literally the public administration academic literature from the 1960s. This definition was given originally at the Minnowbrook Conference of Public Administration, which was hosted by a man named Dwight Waldo, who in 1948 wrote a book titled The Administrative State. And so this definition was kind of agreed upon in 1968, 20 years later, at his conference. And the definition is, remember, it's the administrative state and it's public administration as the field. The definition is, it is an administered economy that adjusts shares such that citizens are made equal. Does anybody know what that defines? An administered economy that redistributes shares so that citizens are made equal, or adjusts shares so that citizens are made equal. Does anybody know what that is? Sounds like communism. Socialism is actually the correct definition, but the word is equity. That's the definition of equity in the public administration literature. Social equity theory is what it's defined under. So now we've established that E in DEI means socialism. It means socialism. It is, by definition, in the relevant context, social equity theory, it is the redistribution of shares by an administrative economy such that citizens are made equal. So now we know the goal of DEI. It is socialism. A lot of you said Marxism or communism. Those aren't perfectly synonymous terms, but they're close enough for government work, and since we're talking about socialism, that's all we need. That was a joke. Haha. So what are the D and the I? Well, it turns out those kind of are they're what serve the E. So E, equity, is the redistribution of shares. It's socialism, so that people are made more equal. Citizens and groups are made more equal. What are the D and the I? Well, they're the service coordination for the goal of the E. Equity is the goal, diversity and inclusion are the tools. And what are they? Well, we look at diversity, for example, and we look at a document, let's say, from one of these public universities. And I do want you to think about this. This is a question I wanted to pose to you before I started rambling about acronyms. Very important question. So I pick a public university. In this case, it's the University of Texas at Austin. And I look at their documentation about their DEI program they're implementing campus-wide, hiring deans every few days, every few days, DEI deans. I don't know about Austin. I do know that that is exactly what they were doing at Oklahoma, which turns out to be more conservative than Texas. They were hiring, on average, in the past calendar year, a new DEI dean every 2.5 days. These are $250,000, when you add in the benefits package, $250,000 a year positions. They have over 100 of them now. Every department has their own. So I wanted to pose this question, though. So I picked University of Texas at Austin. I mentioned the University of Oklahoma. Doesn't matter which university I pick. It literally doesn't matter. Why? And this is what I want you to think about throughout the rest of through the whole talk. And I should have said this at the beginning, but I had 3 cups of coffee. Why is it that every school, every university, every publicly traded company, every government, every state, doesn't matter if it's Idaho or Massachusetts, is doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time to implement something nobody heard of 5 years ago? Why? I will suggest a very uncomfortable answer to this question. But we'll get to that. I pull from this academic literature, this policy literature from the University of Texas at Austin about their DEI program, and it says, well, what is a diversity coordinator? They say they're going to hire a bunch of them at Texas in this document. What is it? Well, they say explicitly it would be against the law to hire diversity according to race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, blah, 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 blah. The whole exhaustive list that even Judith Butler called the exasperated et cetera, because she got so sick of having to write it down again. They said you can't do that. That's against the law. So what we hire is expertise in diversity. That's what we hire for, expertise in diversity. So what in the hell is expertise in diversity? How, am I an expert in diversity? I've read like everything they've written about it. No, I am not an expert in diversity. No. An expert in diversity, it turns out, is somebody who has the relevant experience in diversity, which usually is through lived experience, which therefore becomes a proxy to hiring by race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, exasperated, etc. But they also have to have the authentic understanding of the real or actual conditions of that identity category in order to qualify. That's expertise in diversity. That's called critical consciousness. They have to have been made conscious of the so-called real or actual conditions that have led to what it means to be a woman, or led to what it means to be Black, or what it means to be Latino or Latinx, or Latine, because the Latinx thing fell apart in branding. And I had to change it. Latine isn't going to work either. So it means hiring, there's an old word for this. So this person, what is the diversity expert's job? Well, it's to administer the economy that redistributes shares such that citizens and groups are made more equal. There used to be a name for that, which was, does anybody know the name for that? Commissar. It's not a comfortable name. It is a political officer whose goal is to implement socialism under the brand name equity. And to be hired as a diversity officer, including in your private school, you have to have the correct view of what diversity means, which means the actual conditions that have led to what it means to have been structurally determined as a person of a particular identity category. So what's inclusion? Has anybody happened to have noticed that inclusion is a little bit exclusive? I'm just asking, has anybody happened to notice that fact? Okay, so inclusion is one of the, if you had to, I said all these 3-4 acronyms, if you had to boil things down actually to just 2 words, of what's the problem? Inclusion's one of the 2. We'll get to we said the other one, it's sustainability. Sustainable and inclusion are the 2 watchwords that they are utterly married to and utterly stuck with. What's inclusion? Well, what you have to understand is that the way that this mindset operates is that they think about the meanings of words differently than you do. They have different meanings for words. They understand every politically relevant term in terms of how it's defined by structural oppression as they define structural oppression. By the way, they cannot do structural oppression. Theirs is the only way not to do structural oppression. Structural oppression is them not getting their way. So, what is inclusion? Inclusion is not being excluded, not being made to feel unwelcome, not being made to feel like you don't belong. By virtue of what? Well, they only think in terms of structural power. So in terms of the extant structural power dynamics in society. So if there are structural power dynamics like structural racism, cis heteronormativity, structural sexism and misogyny, etc., those are intrinsically exclusive in the way that causes structural oppression. Nothing else counts. That's how they understand the term. So inclusion means making sure that an environment has none of that, because that would exclude. So anything that reminds or brings to mind or invokes structural oppression on any of these dynamics, according to one of the diversity experts, the political officers that you've hired, anything that invokes exclusion by systemic power is not inclusive. So an inclusive environment is an environment that's been purged of those things. So now you have the hiring of political officers and the purging of that which goes against the political agenda, which is the E, which, when I gave you the definition, literally straight out of their literature, you thought I was talking about communism. So you have what's required for inclusion? What do you have for inclusion? Well, obviously you can't have a racist. That's fine. Okay. You can't have a sexist. You can't have a bigot against gays or trans or what. Okay, fine. With you so far. But you also can't have anything that reminds somebody of those structural power dynamics. They can't even be thought of. So if you have a person who said something racist 15 years ago on Twitter, you have to exclude them because somebody might see them, know they said that thing, be reminded of it, and then the power dynamic is invoked. We've seen across campuses in the past few years, although a little bit less in the last couple of years because it got really bad PR, where people would have, special caucuses or race rooms set up to where this is a black-only space. And why? Because the very inclusion of a white person would remind them of the pervasive white supremacy in society. So now you can exclude people based on things they've said or done in the past, things they are currently saying or doing, or by their very being, because it's actually about whether or not it invokes or reminds of the structural power dynamic, which causes structural harm and structural trauma, which are also defined in those terms. Which is why you have to have mental health counseling to deal with the trauma and the harm. Not to discount the trauma that came from COVID or any of these other things or the psychological abuse of the kids, but also just the trauma of being exposed to structural dynamics. This is inclusion. How extreme is this? The University, adults, University of Wisconsin at Madison, a premier university in this country, had a rock on their campus. It's a 42-ton boulder. A 42-ton boulder. And this is a famous rock. Everybody loved the rock. Chamberlain Rock or something it's called, named after a geologist who studied the rock. It's a type of glacial deposit, some kind of granite. I don't know. I'm not a geologist. Big rock on campus, the rock, And it turns out somebody doing a report on the rock for one of their classes digs up in the microfiche in the library a newspaper report from the 1920s when that type of glacial deposit had a very unsavory, racially tinged name. And this story went out. And because the story went out, the rock now reminds people of that word and is therefore not inclusive. So the university dropped $60,000 to move the rock off campus. The rock was non-inclusive. If you think that they won't remove a person, but they'll remove a rock, which can literally do nothing. I don't know if you've dealt with a lot of rocks. I don't know, maybe you are an animist or something from 200 years ago. Rocks don't do a lot. They kind of just sit there. And unless acted upon by an outside force, they continue to just sit there. one of Newton's laws. They don't do it. So anyway, that's what inclusion is. Censorship and purges. That's what inclusion is. Of dissident things that cause structural oppression to be felt or realized as deemed, not by you, not by anybody, but A, the person claiming it because they are of the relevant identity category, or B, somebody claiming it on their behalf by proxy. Could you imagine what a black person would think about The Rock? Get it off campus. You think that's extreme, but this is in case, you guys all know I wrote a book called Cynical Theories, I think, and I wrote it with a woman named Helen Pluckrose. And Helen Pluckrose, when she was doing her master's degree, wrote about Othello, which is a Shakespearean thing. And there was an interracial relationship in that, and it was a scandal in that. And she wrote, after much research, that in fact, it wasn't a racial scandal, it was a religious scandal. It was a Christian and a Moor, a Muslim. That's the scandal. And her professor said, well, technically you're right, in private to her, grading her paper. But what would a black American think if they read that this wasn't a race issue? You have to change it and say that it was a race issue. You have to revise the history. You have to say that the story means something different than what it means. Otherwise, what would a black person think? There's no black people present. We're not even talking about Americans, but she's bringing up Americans. This is Shakespeare. So somebody by proxy, one of these diversity experts, these commissars, to implement the thing you thought was communism, but it's called equity now. That's what DEI is. So your school has one. I don't care what school you go to, you have one. Liberty University has one. Every university has one. Every HR department in a publicly traded company has one. Probably has a small army of them. That's what they are. That's what they do. So why on earth do we need all these DEI coordinators? Well, because we have to achieve goal number 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. This is going to sound like a conspiracy theory because they told everybody it's a conspiracy theory. So you go to the United Nations website and they call it Agenda 2030, which sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it's all over their website. The Sustainable Development Goals are, in their words, 17 goals to, and I quote, transform our world into a completely different model. And one of the goals is that there's going to be equity. And so we have to have DEI because it meets the Sustainable Development Goal, because we don't have a sustainable planet if we have inequity, which sounds like something, frankly, that a communist would say. If there's no equity, there's no sustainability. It's unsustainable somehow. If we don't redistribute shares so that people are made equal, it's not sustainable. So the Sustainable Development Goals, I'll make you a prediction. Everybody's talking about DEI, everybody's talking a little bit about SEL now. These are the hot topics. People are talking about the gender stuff. This time next year, we're all going to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability. And the reason is because I read the UNESCO documents. UNESCO is United Nations Educational, Science, Cultural Organization. I read the documents, and they have said that TikTok, we're almost out of time. 2030 is almost here. There's a 100-page document published earlier this year that says we need to implement a program where every institute of higher education, not just colleges and universities, but every higher education institute in the world needs to rewrite its mission statement to meet the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. They say, in fact, that one of the things that has to happen with regard to this is that universities have to install lots of SDG officers on top of their ESG officers and their DEI officers. So we need more political officers. Universities are not going to lose, they spend pages telling us how this doesn't threaten academic freedom, but they're also not going to be allowed to do any research or devote any resources to anything that supports non-sustainable practices, including the fossil fuel industry specifically. That's what their document says. This is a much more impactful thing to say when I speak in a state like Louisiana or Texas or Oklahoma or Alaska, which I haven't done yet, because they depend so heavily on the oil industry, or West Virginia with the coal. Lots of states. No unsustainable practices. That's what they say. That's in the document. And they specifically name the fossil fuel industry cannot be supported by any research in any higher education institute in the world, including professional schools, including colleges, universities. I don't know what all they include. They have a huge list in a footnote somewhere in the document. The reason we're doing the DEI stuff is because it's integral to the SDGs. The SDGs is the big picture. This is the big, big picture. These 17 goals to transform our world are the big picture. So put your eye on that ball, start looking down the road to achieve the 17 sustainable development goals of the United Nations Agenda 2030 is meant to be the goal of all higher education institutions by roughly the end of next year, which means it's going to go immediately into primary and secondary education on the back of that. We know that because there are other UNESCO documents. For example, there was one in 2019, which I'll talk about more later. You'll hear why. The title is SEL for SDGs. And they explain that social emotional learning is the ideal tool for teaching young children in primary and secondary school that they are the agents of change who will realize the Sustainable Development Goals. So this time next year, I expect we will all be talking about the SDGs because every educational institution in the world is meant to be repurposed. Now, let me tell you a secret about private schools. A lot of people think, oh, I'm in a private school, I'm safe, I'm above it, I'm whatever. Let me just tell you, the private schools are jerked around on a chain, not just by the NAIS and these independent school organizations, but by the large, let me show how progressive I am, fancy elite colleges. That which Harvard wants, your private school bends over backwards to give Harvard. And Harvard is up to its bad words in this agenda already. They have document after document after document after document they've been publishing since 2015 on transforming Harvard to create a sustainable development university. So your kid's private school is going to be Agenda 2030 school. The document from UNESCO literally says that they must rewrite their mission statements, not to educate, not to broaden minds, to achieve sustainable development goals. So SDGs, real big. There are 17 goals. Nobody can remember them all. They have 169 targets. I don't know who has time to keep up with that. I'm pretty smart. I cannot rattle any of this off. But how are they going to do it? And that's where we come to ESG. As it turns out, there's this character that, again, the conspiracy theory thing happens. His name is Klaus Schwab. He's a professor, is the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. It means it's in Davos and also in China. And Klaus Schwab wrote a book. Actually, he's written a few books. If you bother to read them, they're tedious. I'll save you the trouble. But he wrote a book a little weird. He published a book I'm not going to talk about in 2020, in June of 2020, early June of 2020, titled COVID-19, The Great Reset. You can't talk about the Great Reset. Great Reset, that's a conspiracy theory. It doesn't matter that it's literally the title of that book, and it's literally the title of a book by Richard Florida from 2009. It's a conspiracy theory. It doesn't matter that billions of dollars are dumped into it. It doesn't matter that it has an official launch date. It's a conspiracy theory. And what he says in that book, the only thing I'll say about it is that COVID-19 is a narrow window of opportunity to institute a complete change of our world systems, including our economic system, into what he calls stakeholder capitalism. Shareholders out, stakeholders in. What's a stakeholder? You are, right? You're a stakeholder in your kid's education. You're a stakeholder in if the companies that you purchase products from or have in your community pollute the environment. If they dump a bunch of poison into the Charles, that matters to you. If they pollute the streets, that matters to you. If they cause rampant abuse or, sponsor genocides in China, whoops, not that one. That matters to you. You're a stakeholder, except you're not. They can't ask you. There's too many of you. So they appoint a stakeholder council of the elites that meet in Davos, because they're the experts. People like John Kerry, people like Bill Gates, people like Klaus Schwab, people like Larry Fink. And they become a council of stakeholders on your behalf who are going to decide how capitalism is going to operate so that it administers shares correctly to achieve environmental, social, and governance goals for a variety of different purposes, namely and specifically achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030 in the short term. Now, I keep calling this a council of stakeholders because I want to brag of one of two words I know in Russian. I know the fun one, na zdrovye. You guys know that one? So we all got to drink. And drink and drink and drink. I got named an honorary Russian in college at one point, and we won't talk about how we got there. It was a rough night. The other word that I know in Russian is the word for council. It's Soviet. And so now we are getting to an explanation of how every organization is doing the same thing. We're getting color on the canvas painted by the earlier speakers. Jeremy was speaking this morning, and I was like, how do people not see that this is Soviet? He's talking about how all these things are going wrong, and they just cook up new ways to explain the words so that paper's over the fact. How do you think Chernobyl melted down? Why did it melt down? Because it's Soviet. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for the failing activity. In a Soviet, you have a council that makes all the decisions, and you create a bureaucratic structure where always somebody above you or always somebody below you is to blame, so that you're never to blame for everybody. And nobody takes responsibility for anything until everything falls apart while it tries to redistribute shares. So we have a Soviet of stakeholders that meet in Davos and other places that are supposed to decide for the stakeholders as the experts exactly how to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And what they came up with is this, well, what they adopted actually is this scam called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Scoring for Corporations. Where did that come from? Would you be in the least bit surprised if I told you it came from the United Nations? No, of course you wouldn't. A man named James Gifford in 2003 was a hot shot, fresh out of his education. He was an environmentalist, cared about forests, deforestation, and he had a cool pitch that he sent to the United Nations and ended up becoming a major intern. He is now a major business leader in Europe. And his idea was there are trillions and trillions of dollars of pension capital just sitting there that can't be used for impact investing because technically the asset managers don't own it. So it would be unethical for them to invest it to achieve social and environmental goals. Impact investing is fine. If you want to engage in it, that's your right. You should be able to. If you care about a particular issue, by all means, dump your money into some company that supports that issue, whether it's social, whether it's environmental, whether it's whatever. But this isn't you deciding what to do with your money by investing it in companies that are doing things in the world you want seen with an environmental or social agenda. This is asset managers deciding for you as a council of stakeholders how they're going to do that to achieve particular goals. And the acronym they decided upon by 2005, remember this started in 2003, for this program was called ESG. And they figured out that if they started naming ETFs, and if they started creating other index fund rankings according to ESG measurements as the stakeholders determine them for good environmental stewardship, good corporate social responsibility, and proper government or corporate governance, then they could actually steer companies to do the right thing by doing impact investing with $6 to $10 trillion of other people's retirement money. And if you think, wait a minute, that might be a scam, it is. And if you think, wait a minute, if they have that many assets, it's like the financial equivalent of Jimmy the Gun showing up and saying, if you don't want something bad to happen to your restaurant, maybe you should do blah, 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 like sell a bunch of your oil infrastructure to PetroChina, which is what Larry Fink literally did earlier this year. He pressured ExxonMobil to sell a ton of their stuff so their ESG score in the environmental category would go up to PetroChina. Never mind that Larry Fink or his companies happen to own 2 trillion shares of PetroChina. Never mind that China will be exempted from these because it's a developing nation that they have to help bring up. That's all in the SDGs as well, that you have to gauge different nations by where they are in terms of how strictly they have to follow these rules. We're going to do impact investing with other people's money. Now, how many assets do these people manage? If you take the top 3 investment banks, to give you an idea of the amount of power these people have, which are BlackRock, the Vanguard Group, which nobody knows who owns that, and it's funny that it's called Vanguard, given the conversation, if you know your history, and then State Street, so just those 3. It's just short of 40% of the entire S&P 500. That's how many assets they have under management. Estimates range from $6 to $20 trillion. $20 trillion is just a little over a quarter of the world's assets. Imagine owning 25% of the world's assets. Imagine owning 40%, or owning control, I should say, because they don't own any of it. Owning control of 40% of the S&P 500. So why is Disney making a bunch of stuff and then doubling down in it that's making everybody mad? The ESG score goes up because that social score requires it. Why is every public university that's now painted itself into a corner with this huge, weird student services competition that they've been in for years, building crazy new dorms, crazy facilities, student services, bowling alleys, movie theaters, to try to attract students with all that nice underwritten student loan money? Why on earth is every single one of them doing the exact same thing? ESG score goes up. Thus, the way that their pension funds are managed, the way that the interest rates on their gigantic $200+ million loans that they're now underwater with are managed, all depends on their ESG score. Which is why I keep saying this is the answer to your question. This is a cartel. This is a financial cartel. They're not using guns like in Mexico. They're not paramilitary. This is a financial cartel. They will whack your company. If you have control, if you have access or control to 40% of a company's assets, you can say, I'm going to sell all those assets, and we'll just see how your company does on the market. We're going to scare all the investors. We're going to say you're a bad deal. We're going to dump 40% of your value in a day, so the price is going to go down like a rock. Good luck. We're not going to list you in any of this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Companies are not operating in a market situation qua a market situation. The market is a controlled market by these gigantic financiers. This is how this works. So go woke, go broke is correct logic in a market. Go woke or go broke is ESG logic. And you have to bear in mind that the Council of Stakeholders, the Soviet, is what's going to decide what constitutes ESG policy. What's the best example of this? We could talk about a lot of things. COVID-19, environmental hazard, masks. Whoops, 160 billion of them ended up in the ocean. ESG score went up. Whoops. Social, weapons manufacturing, Halliburton, blah, blah, blah. Bad. Socially irresponsible, not good. Bad, right? Ukraine conflict, nope, social good. Halliburton's on the list. Totally arbitrary. They have a goal they want to achieve. I don't care what you think about the Ukraine conflict. It doesn't matter. What matters is that these people said this is bad, and then 2 days later they said this is good. Because there's a social environment that changed. Here's a better example, the best example. Tesla has like a perfect ESG rating, way out in front with electric cars, environmental stewardship, blah, blah, blah. Golden goose of the whole program, making them money hand over fist. Elon Musk says, I'm going to buy Twitter, which, by the way, he has now. Instantaneously, his ESG score plummeted because he was behaving in a socially irresponsible way. According to who? To you? I got kicked off Twitter, not to me. I'm a stakeholder in this, not to me. Something like 60% of the traffic to my website, which pays my salary through generous crowdfunding, was driven through Twitter. Gone in a day. I'm a stakeholder in this. Do they care what I think? No. The Grand Council decided that Elon Musk owning Twitter and making it a place for more free speech was socially irresponsible behavior. Then they concocted a bunch of narratives about Tesla being a racist company, plummeted his ESG score. Turns out Elon's stronger than they thought. It didn't work out, but they tried to wreck him. He came out on the other side. Would Coca-Cola? I don't know. But they taught all their company that Coca-Cola strives for people to be less white. Very famously, that got exposed. Did Disney? Man, could you imagine owning stock in Disney right now? Whew. Just taking it on the chin. They're like, give me another. Take it on the chin. No, we're going to make a movie about the most perverted stuff you can imagine. We're going to make a movie about demons and stuff. Whack, another $10 billion. Unbelievable. Why? Because go woke or go broke is the logic when you have that much control of financial assets. Which, by the way, this sounds like, I literally sound like an old school leftist talking about this. The fact that the left has bent itself in a knot to kiss butt to the largest financial institutes in the world is just mind-boggling until you realize that it's actually about power. Their agenda is getting implemented, so they love it. So that's ESG. What Klaus Schwab says, then we'll get to SEL. What Klaus Schwab says about ESG, he says, Well, if you want to implement the sustainable and inclusive world that the SDGs are meant to achieve, that ESG is made to facilitate, he said you need to do 3 things. This is in his second book that I haven't talked about yet, which is called, a little presumptuously, The Great Narrative for a Better Future. The Great Reset, Book 2. In case you wondered if the Great Reset's a conspiracy theory, he wrote 2 books about it. This one's called The Great Narrative for a Better Future. The Great Narrative, by the way, is that humanity faces gigantic existential risks, synthetic biology, climate change, blah, 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 the cyber attacks, all these different things that he's named, that some of which he might be planning to do, I don't know. We have these huge problems, so we need global cooperation managed through helpful NGOs like his to make sure that everybody's on the same page in order to get through this. And what we're going to establish, he says, liberal democracies don't like this. We're going to establish something called a public-private partnership. We're going to collude between the corporations and the government. As my friend Vivek says it, that which they can't achieve through the front door of the government, they will achieve through the back door of the corporations, which is why the federal government can't censor you, but Twitter can. Or Instagram can. It's a private company. They can do what they want, even when the government's asking them to do that, which is actually a clear First Amendment violation. They can pressure you out of a bank, just like the federal government did. Why? Do you know why PayPal is doing this weird misinformation, we're going to take $2,500 from you thing? Because Patriot Act counterterrorism laws say that if any financial institution is caught up in this kind of stuff, and now they've defined being against them as domestic terrorism, as you know, then the financial institution can be massively fined by the federal government. So PayPal is just covering its butt. I don't want to save PayPal, I'm just telling you. What they can't accomplish through the front door of the government, they accomplish through the back door of the corporation, through a public-private partnership. And Klaus Schwab says in the Great Narrative, we don't like that in the West, but guess what? We're going to do it. And we're going to create a ton of top-down pressure to force companies, or force is Larry Fink's word, nudge companies into adopting ESG policies. This is what he says. This is what your Council of Stakeholders, your Soviet, is doing. But not all of them will. The problem is some are going to go rogue. They aren't going to do it. Some of those universities are going to realize that there are millions and millions, possibly 100 million conservative family, or 100 million conservative people in this country of voting age, so adults, that have families that want to send their kids to college somewhere, and you would think maybe the University of Oklahoma, in the state that brags that it's the most conservative state in the country, would think, I bet I could attract a lot of students with my huge student services arms race to attract all that money. I bet I could get a lot of students by bucking DEI, by being the one university that answers the questions for conservatives. Where can I send my kids to college where they're not going to get indoctrinated or brainwashed with this stuff? And I talked to the president of the University of Oklahoma, Joe Harris, last year, and I explained all this to him in about 20 minutes, and he sat in his chair, and he crossed his legs, and he got his little I can't cross my legs, I have big legs. And he got his little smile, he leaned forward, politician mode kicked in, and he said, we just want to make a campus where everybody feels like they belong. And I was like, that's your answer? Your program's called Lead On. Lead, you're following. Why? I pushed him on it. He was like, well, you're going to like what I have coming next. Don't worry, I got a free speech statement. You're going to love it. I didn't love it. But at the office, I didn't have it, so I couldn't say I didn't love it at the time. So none will attempt this. None. Why? ESG. That's why. They are under a huge other pressure. There is no market. If there were a market, somebody would do the experiment because they're going to go gangbusters. Parler tried to be in a market. Oh, Twitter's blah, blah, blah. Make your own Twitter. Parler did. Boom, nuked from orbit. Canceled from the Play Store. Canceled from the Apple Store. Didn't deter them. They were built a website, downloaded. It was still being heavily downloaded. It was the most downloaded app, period, for a week. They put it on their website, still going gangbusters. Amazon steps in, cancels their servers. Media comes in and says there was a massive security breach and all this. They leaked all your information. Turned out most of that wasn't true. So they ran a huge operation to destroy Parler. Literally rods from God. Boom, gone. This isn't how a market works. This isn't a market. Something else is going on. And your kids are needed, because this is what Klaus says next. We won't be able to force everybody. Somebody might still do the experiment. apparently not a university. But some corporations might. So what we're going to do is we're going to create demand in the younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, the generation after. And they're already radicalizing. They already refuse to work for corporations that aren't environmentally responsible. They don't want to work for a corporation that's not socially responsible. They will refuse to be your customer, refuse to be your employee, refuse to be your client, refuse to work for you. There will be a massive protest in the younger generations to demand these changes from the bottom up. Top down doesn't work, we have the bottom up too. The third thing he says is that we have to rewrite the social contract, tear apart the very connective tissue or glue of the society and write something new. The Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Inclusive Future, that's the new social contract. And how do you do those two things? He keeps referring to the younger generations, and the documents that the World Economic Forum he runs keeps putting out are, since 2015, in case you wonder how long, which happens to be the same year that that CASEL lobbied to get the Every Student Succeeds Act passed, which mandates reporting on one non-academic competency, and then their army of consultants went out into the world and said, we have this thing called social emotional learning that happens to do exactly that. Why don't you implement it? In 2015, Klaus Schwab writes his first, or not him personally, his organization, World Economic Forum, writes its first white paper about social emotional learning and how it's the future of education. In 2016, they doubled down, saying it's going to be heavily involved in ed tech, wearable technologies to gauge the emotions of the children in real time, eye tracking devices on the little devices they carry around with them. Digital friends powered by AI. So they don't have any real friends. They're being raised by their devices, and now there's going to be an AI that they're going to go confess all their secrets to. Their real friend is going to be a digital avatar controlled by Microsoft, or controlled by Google, or controlled by Apple. And they will pour their guts into it like Ginny Weasley talking to Tom Riddle in the diary in the second part of Harry Potter, and they are going to just collect all that data off of their kids. And this is what Klaus Schwab says. Because what Klaus Schwab realizes is that if you're going to build an entirely new economy, you have to figure out two things. If you want to put a peg in a hole, as we say, let's say it's a round peg in a round hole, they've got to be the same shape, right? Well, the problem is we don't know what shape the hole needs to be, for sure, and we don't know what shape the pegs are, for sure. But if we could data mine the crap out of kids, we could figure out what shapes both things have to be. So if you come up with a program where you data mine kids relentlessly and then feed that back into the system to poke the kids and then data mine the data that comes out of that to see what happens in a kind of Ouroboros-shaped scientific program of discovering who people are, then you can build the economy of the future and the plugins that go into it at the same time. And they call that social emotional learning. I don't know how much you trust social emotional learning, but you need to trust it less. I'm not going to go into all of the scary stuff about it. I could actually talk, I just did 2 days ago in Charleston, talked for an hour about social emotional learning by itself. I just want to actually present to you that one document from UNESCO from 2019 that I already mentioned, but I'm going to give you an example of how social emotional learning works after that. This document is called SEL for SDGs. And what they say is it turns out if you tell kids that their job is to become change agents for sustainability in the planet, this induces a large amount of stress. They also say some of these goals, the 17 goals to transform our world, are inherently contradictory with one another. This induces what they call cognitive dissonance. That's what this paper is about. And they say that social emotional learning is the ideal tool to manage the stress and cognitive dissonance of telling children that the point of their education is to satisfy the Sustainable Development Goals, because it teaches them to manage their emotions. It teaches them to manage their social circumstances. That's what this is about, gathering the data to build the peg, to build the hole that it'll fit into, so they know what it looks like, and then managing the damage, the psychological and social damage it causes while they test out the various parts of this. The DEI, socially destructive. The trans stuff. We talk about the physical mutilation, we don't talk about the psychological mutilation. SEL is meant to help them become resilient. What's the opposite of resilience? Fragility, right? White fragility. Everybody remember that? So if I get called a racist and I'm like, dude, no, that's white fragility. For me to be resilient, I have to say, Please, sir, may I have another? What did you want me to do? I can't ask you to teach me about racism because that's called epistemic exploitation. That's not allowed. I have to go listen and learn for myself, and I have to do the work. That's what SEL is for, is to teach resilience in the face of literal brainwashing. I'm not going to talk to you about what literal brainwashing is. It's Xi now in Chinese. That's a whole other hour-long talk. So this is what social emotional learning is for. Now you see what it is that, yeah, we do want kids to learn social and emotional skills. We do want kids to grow up with good social and emotional skills, with emotional maturity, with self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making. These are the brand names of CASEL, the programs, the targets or competency groups. We do want that, but nobody stops to ask, is it the freaking school's job? I'm not saying that it's never the school's job. Maybe you implement something where you actually identify at-risk kids and you take them aside in a therapeutic environment with an actual therapist because that's not available to them some other way, and you give them some kind of counseling session separate from everybody else to deal with their at-risk issues, and then it turns out there is a lot of data that supports that this can work and can work well. That's the sales pitch. They tell you it's evidence-based. There's your evidence. But what they implement is called systemic transformative SEL. It's woven into every subject in school. It's tucked into the math lesson, tucked into the history lesson, tucked into the reading and writing lessons. That comes from Paulo Freire, a Brazilian Marxist educator who devised a means called generative themes learning that allows for that to happen, that they've imported. How do I know that? Linda Darling-Hammond, who's one of the executives at CASEL, one of the leaders of CASEL from the beginning, one of the lobbyists for CASEL that got the Every Student Succeeds Act passed in 2015, on the Biden and Obama education transition teams. Linda Darling-Hammond wrote the foreword to the book, Social Emotional Learning and Research and Practice, 2015. And she says explicitly that the goal of a social emotional learning equipped school is to implement Paulo Freire's vision of transformation and humanization, which she then quotes Freire on, which is straight up Marx's program of humanizing, which Freire's not abashed at all to say he got it from Marx. He says it over and over again in his books. This is exactly what this is for. So what they're actually going to do is that they're going to take the social and emotional content and they're going to pick a lens that is the right answer to the social emotional stuff and weave that into everything. By the way, every kid is now at risk, at least in public schools, in 40-something states. How? They redefined at risk of not graduating college and career ready. How? They redefined college and career ready to mean not SEL competent. So now under at-risk funding from the federal government, like ESSER 3 funding, for example, Title I funding, every kid is at risk, and the solution to their at-risk problem is to build SEL programs. And so billions and billions of dollars of federal money are dumping in to build these programs to fix the at-risk kids that you think are troubled kids who don't have a good home life, but in fact are every kid by their new weird definition. And then they can point to examples like Jeremy gave this morning that make it true that every kid is at risk. They're all screwed up right now. They're all screwed up. They're like all but like 10%. This is what they've done to work this in. But they work it into every subject through an equity lens. So they reframe, this is what Paulo Freire's idea was. When you're going to teach a subject, you use generative concepts or generative themes in order to get engagement up, to get the students interested in wanting to learn the subject. Okay? So he says the point is to teach them political literacy along with actual literacy. You data mine the students, you question them, you survey them, you talk to them, he says, to find out what's relevant in their lives. They call this culturally relevant teaching, the other CRT now. In fact, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who wrote the papers on this in 1995 and started culturally relevant teaching, says she's repackaging Paulo Freire into a new race-based domain, identity politics-based domain. She says it. This is what it is. And so then you give a political literacy lesson to make the students interested, then allegedly they learn. Now, they did an experiment on this in Nigeria in 2007, and the result was nobody learned. In fact, the students saw no point in learning anymore, turned on the instructors, yelled at them, screamed for change, and became, in their own words, quote, emotional wrecks who often could not talk and spent a lot of time crying. Saw no point in learning any longer. It doesn't work, except to raise political consciousness. That works. So here's how this works you can imagine the complicated, big picture, like obvious ones, like sticking a drag queen in class. Why drag queens? Because they do what the academic literature, and pardon my language, this is their word for it, they do what the academic literature in queer theory calls fucking gender. That's what it's called, gender fucking. They put the drag queen in, and the kid's like, why are you a man dressed as a woman, and now do men and women always have to dress like men and women? Now they have to have a discussion about it. Those are obvious. Making them read 75 books about Ruby Bridges and the Tulsa Massacre, those are fairly obvious. Except you're like, well, I can't say no to a book about, what do I do? But here's where it gets really nasty and subtle. Here's a math example. This is a real math example an educator gave me a few weeks ago. Here's a word problem. I want you to think through this word problem. I did this in Charlotte, and the little 7-year-old was in the audience, and he answered the question. It's cute. This is a second grade word problem. Don't stress out. I'm not going to do, we were talking about inflection points earlier. That's the second derivative is 0. We're not going to do that. Johnny is riding with his mom and dad to the amusement park in the car. The amusement park is 50 miles away. They've driven 30 miles. How much further is there to go? Typical second grade word problem, right? How does a generative theme work? Well, the teacher, this is actually how teachers in the United States are being instructed to do SEL. On this question, this was taken straight out of a training manual. Before we start, why don't we just take a minute? Who's been to an amusement park? Kids? That's engaging, right? Get the kids interested. Who's been to an amusement park? Half the kids raise their hand, half the kids don't. Some of you have been, some of you haven't. What's some reasons why people maybe would or wouldn't go to amusement parks? Let's talk about that before we answer the question. Eventually, somebody says some people can't afford to go to amusement parks. And now the door's open, you're talking about poverty for half an hour. Somebody raises their hand and says, well, something about the race issue and poverty and the correlations come up. Now you're talking about CRT for half an hour. Probably no second grader realizes that this correlates with sexuality as well. It could come up. It could be brought up. It becomes generative. That question became generative of poverty and race. But we have mom and dad. Are all families made of moms and dads? Does anybody have a family that's mom and dad? Raise your hand. Oh, not everybody. What about you? Oh, my mom's a single mom. Now we're talking about feminism. Well, I have 2 moms. Now we're talking about sexuality. Is it a good thing to go ride in a car for 50 miles just to go have fun? Now we're talking about environmentalism. Johnny's riding with his parents. Some of you guys don't get to go to amusement parks, but you want to. You guys, some said no, but you want to go. You want to check it out. But your parents said you're not old enough. What about parental authority? Do parents really have the authority to make those kinds of decisions for children? Now you're having that conversation. This is how the SEL generative themes method works, and the goal is to always frame everything in terms of equity. That's the political consciousness. So when you have the poverty discussion, you say, well, what could we do, kids? How could we make it so everybody can go to an amusement park and have fun? Well, the rich people could pay for the poor people. We could make it free, blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, you're having a lesson on socialism or equity. That's how social emotional learning can work. In fact, does work. That's how teachers are trained to do it. It's very, very subtle. Or it can be. It can be literally a drag queen in glitter. There's an academic paper about that, by the way. They say that the purpose of the drag queen is to be a generative object in the classroom. The last sentence in the paper is that we will leave a trail of glitter in the carpet that will never come out. That's the last sentence in the paper that was written by Harris Kornstein, who is the drag queen known as Lil Miss Hot Mess, that is one of the executives on the Drag Queen Story Hour program. That's grooming. That's why I got kicked off Twitter for calling stuff like that grooming. That's child grooming. They say that the point of it, by the way, is not to, they say openly, LGBT empathy, marketing pitch. They say that. It is a marketing strategy. Real goal, induce living queerly. Teach children queer ways of being. Induce alternate modes of kinship. And then they explain that Drag Queen Story Hour is family friendly in the sense where family is meant the way that old school queer code meant your street family that you leave your family for. It's family friendly. They just mess with the meanings of words. This is SEL. And what I've said is just scratches the surface of how not good it is. What you really, really should worry about is it's a data mining operation to build the future out of your kids while repurposing your kids to fit into the future that they want to build. Which future? The one that's ESG compliant because it satisfies the Sustainable Development Goals. Where does DEI fit in this? That S in ESG, social, is short for social justice or equity. There's your DEI program stuck right in the middle of the S of ESG. So this alphabet soup is the enemy. Sustainable Development Goals, ESG, and social emotional learning are working in concert to achieve something literally called Agenda 2030 to transform the world into something completely different. In fact, a different economy that's a stakeholder economy that has a council of stakeholders that know better than you, that are going to decide everything for you and your children's future. If you want to play in that system, you can. I don't. I don't think you should. But that's the system if you want a glimpse of what it looks like. Very famously, Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell, said, if you want a glimpse of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. I would tell you that you only have to look as far away, not to fiction, not to East Asia from Oceania, but over to China. China has this model already. That's another hour-long talk that I could explain how this works and what the relevance to the West is. China has this model already. That's the goal of what they're doing, is to create a blended economy that is capitalist and socialist at the same time. That's the goal of this. That's why it doesn't look like communism or Marxism, and it doesn't quite look like fascism, but it kind of looks like all of them. That's the future you're signing up for. And if you think, hey, maybe I'm rich, I'm an elite, I want my kids, this is the world we're going to, I want to be in charge of it. I want my kids to be in charge of it. I'll point out that just last week, the former president of China, Hu Jintao, was escorted out of Congress because Xi Jinping doesn't like him anymore. The former president of the country is now no good. If that's what you want to sign your kids up for, I'll pray for you. Thank you for your time. We can stop this. We only have to know what it is and say no. What do you have to do? Tell 2 friends, or 3, and get them to tell 2 friends. Don't take my word for it. Don't make them watch my talk. Look up these things yourself. Read some UNESCO documents about education. Read some SEL books. Take the time to learn what's going on. Read what ESG came from and how it works, how they change it when they want to change it. Read Klaus Schwab's books, and then tell 2 friends or 3 friends. If we get 0.3% of the population who's informed, they can lead 3 to 4% of the population who knows enough to fight. If we get 3 to 4% of the population, we can actually stop this, because that's about what it takes to change the world. Thank you again for your time. That's what I had to say.